This is VOA Africa.
Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Ewart. It's Thursday, March 11th. Welcome to Africa 54. We continue to work remotely because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but what hasn't changed is our commitment to bringing you the latest and most important news from the African continent and around the world. This is today's Africa 54. Ivory Coast's President Alassane Ouattara says his Prime Minister Hamed Bakayoko has died of cancer in Germany, where he was hospitalized. David Doyle reports.
Ivory Coast's Prime Minister Hamed Bakayoko, seen as a likely successor to President Alassane Ouattara, has died in Germany, the government said on Wednesday. A former media executive who turned to politics, he acted as a negotiator and intermediary between warring factions during a prolonged civil war in the West African country from the early 2000s. The 56-year-old was also a close Ouattara ally and was picked to be Prime Minister in July 2020 following the sudden death of his predecessor, Amadou Gon Coulibaly. On Twitter, Ouattara described Bakayoko as a great statesman, a model for our youth, and a personality of great generosity and exemplary loyalty. Ouattara said Bakayoko had died of cancer. He was flown to France on February the 18th for medical checks and later to Freiburg in Germany.
David Doyle of Reuters with that report. Tanzania's main opposition leader, Tundu Lissu, has demanded information on the health of President John Magufuli, a prominent COVID-19 skeptic whose absence from public view has brought speculation he is receiving medical treatment abroad. Tanzania's government has made no official comment. The Nation newspaper in neighboring Kenya reported that an African leader, not seen in public for nearly 2 weeks, was being treated for COVID-19 on a ventilator at a private Nairobi hospital. It cited unidentified political and diplomatic sources for the report and did not identify the leader. Magufuli, a 61-year-old leader nicknamed the Bulldozer, was last seen in public on February 27, looking like his normal self, as he swore in a new chief secretary at State House in Tanzania's commercial capital, Dar es Salaam. On Wednesday, Lissu told Reuters that multiple sources had told him that Magufuli was in Nairobi Hospital, but that there were now plans underway to move him to India. In West Africa, callers seeking the parents of lost children have been regularly dialing into radio and television programs since a series of explosions leveled much of Equatorial Guinea's largest city and sent thousands fleeing to the countryside. 3 days on, residents of Bata are still coming to grips with the full scale of a tragedy that has killed at least 105 people and injured more than 600 others. Drone footage aired on state television showed block after block of public housing in the coastal city, either completely destroyed or close to it, the remnants of their roofs and walls strewn across the neighborhood's dirt roads. The reclusive government blamed the explosions of fires set by farmers living near the military base and the negligent handling of dynamite stocks by the military unit guarding them. It has decreed 3 days of national mourning from Wednesday. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told a congressional panel he will meet with top Chinese diplomats next week and will discuss a host of issues that concern the United States. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain reports.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken outlined the Biden administration's top foreign policy priorities in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee Wednesday. His announcement that he will meet for the first time with China's top diplomats next week in Alaska on the way back from a trip to Japan and South Korea prompted a number of questions from lawmakers. Blinken assured them he would raise a host of U.S. concerns and said for now, this is a one-time meeting.
There's no intent at this point for a series of follow-on engagements. Those engagements, if they are to follow, really have to be based on the proposition that we're seeing tangible progress and tangible outcomes on the issues of concern to us with China.
Blinken agreed with a number of lawmakers from both parties that China's repression of ethnic Muslim Uyghur and other minorities in the Xinjiang region amounts to genocide, and called on Beijing to grant access to the international community and the United Nations.
If they have nothing to hide, show it to us. Show the world.
Several Republican lawmakers asked about migrants trying to cross the U.S. southern border with Mexico and why the Biden administration canceled asylum agreements signed by the Trump administration with Central American countries.
We've seen a massive surge of migrants crossing and causing a crisis at our southern border. Why did the president rescind these agreements that were supported by our neighbors to the south?
Blinken didn't respond directly, but said President Joe Biden is determined that the U.S. have a safe, orderly, and humane border with Mexico. He was also asked about the humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia's Tigray region and strongly condemned what he called acts of ethnic cleansing there.
Prime Minister Abiy was an inspiring leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now he needs to step up and make sure that his own people in Tigray are getting the protections that they need and deserve.
Blinken said he has been on the phone repeatedly with Prime Minister Abiy and other leaders in the region to try to find a way to end the violence against civilians. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
The United States on Wednesday blacklisted two Islamist extremist groups in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Mozambique as foreign terrorist organizations over accusations of links to Islamic State. The Allied Democratic Forces in Congo and its leader, Seka Musa Baluku, and Mozambique's Alu Suna Wajama and its leader, Abu Yasir Hassan, were also named specially designated global terrorists. The United States dubbed the groups ISIS DRC and ISIS Mozambique. The Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, a Ugandan insurgent faction active in eastern Congo since the 1990s, has committed a spate of brutal reprisal attacks on civilians since the army began operations against it in the late 2019. Senegal's opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko, is out on bail after being indicted on a rape charge that has sparked violent protests across the country over the past week. Sonko has dismissed the charge as politically motivated and has called for more protests against the country's president. VOA's Maria Diallo reports.
Ousmane Sonko's release on bail was cheered by supporters of the opposition leader after days of violent protests in Senegal, which left at least a dozen people dead, according to Amnesty International. The human rights group is calling on the government to bring those responsible for the violence to justice.
There's 12 individuals, most of them aged under 20, died in the context of the policing of the protests, but also for those members of the security forces that are responsible to be tried and prosecuted before the courts of law. But beyond, there's cases of lethal use of force. We have also seen violations against press freedom and freedom of expression.
Sonko's release on bail Monday came after he was indicted on a rape charge that he and his supporters say is politically motivated.
Free Ousmane Sonko, free him. He is a political hostage,
Sonko blames his arrest on President Macky Sall, whom he says is trying to sideline him before the 2024 presidential election. Sall defeated Sonko, among others, in the 2019 election to win a second term in office. The opposition leader is calling on supporters to continue their protests.
We call on the Senegalese people and the youth in particular not to let up on mobilizing, not to break up this exceptional mobilization. The victims of violence must not have been in vain, so that this never happens again in Senegal.
The unrest is the worst the country has seen in years, with young people venting frustrations about unemployment, inequality, and corruption.
We don't care about Sonko or Macky Sall. What we care about is to earn a living. That is what we use to manage our families, our children. They need to think about that because just like them, we are Senegalese. We must not burn the country. It is not worth it.
In his first public comments since the turmoil started, President Sall said he understands why young people are protesting.
I've seen many of you take to the streets to express your anger over your unhappiness. That's because you don't have a job, because you aspire to a better future, because after a year of pandemic, your daily life is still affected by economic gloom, with social restrictions and limits on recreational and leisure spaces.
The demonstrations started last Wednesday before Sonko's initial court appearance for questioning on the rape accusations. Mariama Diallo, VOA News.
Tunisian police are arresting social media activists for criticizing the government online and calling for protests, according to rights groups. Nicole Dilio has more from Tunis, Tunisia.
10 years after Tunisia's Arab Spring uprising for democracy, the country has been hit by a wave of riots and protests over ongoing political unrest and a poor economy. While protesters take to the streets, bloggers criticize authorities online. Rights groups say police are cracking down on them, with at least 50 arrested so far this year. Ahmed Ghram was jailed for 2 weeks for a Facebook post.
When you're treated less than a human for that long, it kind of leaves its mark on you. It's shameful for the government and the people that we still get prosecuted and arrested for our freedom.
Tunisian activists say a decade after the Arab Spring, there is still a price to pay for speaking their mind.
Freedoms are threatened. Today, freedom of speech is being attacked, and people are still getting arrested during the protests.
Rights groups say progress after the Arab Spring is being reversed.
After the revolution, freedom of expression became a reality in Tunisia. But we noticed in the last 3 years an increase in prosecution of bloggers and activists for their online posts. We call on the Tunisian authorities to repeal these abusive and repressive legislation.
Authorities are using a pre-Arab Spring law to threaten internet freedom and those who insult or disturb others with up to 2 years in prison.
Article 86 of the Telecommunication Code was written in an era where there was no internet, meaning before the revolution and before the youth got freedom of speech. Charging under it is a systemic state policy that aims to shut mouths, prohibit any attempt to discuss politics, and make it a taboo.
Tunisian authorities decline requests for a comment. Nicole Dilio for VOA News, Tunis.
On January 30th, 2020, the World Health Organization's Director General Tedros Adhanom Gebreyesus declared the novel coronavirus a public health emergency of international concern. WHO described the virus a pandemic 1 year ago on March 11th, as COVID-19 was spreading to more countries worldwide and death rates continued to increase. Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Modu sat down with WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Gebreyesus to assess the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact in the world the past year, particularly in Africa. In an excerpt of the interview, Mr. Gebreyesus elaborates on some of the lessons learned.
First of all, the highest level of public health emergency is what we declared on January 30th. What we did, as you said, in March is describing, the situation since it was really increasing in terms of geography that countries affected, and also in terms of the number of cases. And the lessons learned, I think one very important lesson is, the importance of investment in public health. When I say public health, it covers many of the aspects that we're saying now, which are very important for emergency preparedness and response. As you may know, and as you know, many countries, high-income countries, were surprised by the pandemic because they have been investing in medicine, in secondary, tertiary services, subspecialty services. But their investment in primary health care, in public health, the basic of public health was really minimal. So countries should really give attention to public health, to primary health care, in order to prepare for the future and also finish this pandemic. And the other important lesson from the last 1 year is when politics and science is not aligned, there is a danger. In some countries, we have seen that the expert advice goes one side while the political decisions were going the other side. And that was actually helping the virus to spread. So it's very important that we don't politicize outbreaks, epidemics, or pandemics. Then the other important element is a lesson in the past year, not only the national capacity in terms of preparedness and focus on science and helping politics to support science, but also the global coordination has to be strengthened. And the other lesson could be the One Health approach.
According to the United Nations, One Health is an approach to designing and implementing programs, policies, legislation, and research in which multiple sectors communicate and work together to achieve better public health outcomes. We'll have more of health correspondent Lino Mudu's exclusive interview with WHO's Director General Tedros Adhanom Gebreyesus next week on Africa 54 coming up. A system that enables African patients to have an online consultations with doctors abroad. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Africa 54. With COVID-19 still limiting travel, a Cameroonian startup has created a system that allows African medical patients to have an online consultation with doctors abroad. Anne Nzoaku has this report from Yaoundé, Cameroon, narrated by Moki Edwin Kinzeka.
Yvonne has been sick for years. For the past year, she has tried to go abroad to see a specialist, but travel outside Cameroon is difficult because of the COVID pandemic. She finally found an alternative at Home Care Services, a private company that enables a patient to speak with a doctor living abroad. Yvonne has chosen to receive a second medical opinion from a specialist in France. This is done in the presence of a general practitioner who is at her side in Cameroon.
I've been trying in vain for a long time to meet specialists without success. Today I had the opportunity to have a consultation with one who is abroad and who gave me the direction for the solution to my problem. I am really happy for that.
The system was made possible by the Cameroon company Medic Afrique. The patient or a patient's family living abroad pays a fee for Medic Afrique to connect the patient with doctors living in France or Canada. Medic Afrique has almost 100 clinics and specialists participating in the network, with doctors speaking to patients in Cameroon, Togo, and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Because of the enthusiasm of the users, we are working in the medium term, even in the very short term, to extend the product to the whole of Africa, to as many countries as possible.
Dr. Daniel Wang, who lives in Cameroon, says the online consultations are a good idea and notes that many patients now use the technology because of COVID-19. But he hopes that patients also continue to have confidence in their local doctor.
We must make it clear to the patient that we are in the best position to give direction. We simply integrate what comes from elsewhere so that we do not have a limited opinion. This spirit of collaboration must also be with the other doctors abroad, who must know that they are not dictating a way of doing things to us, but are adding to what we are doing to be able to complete our opinion.
At Cameroon's National College of Doctors, they also believe that patients benefit from getting a second opinion from doctors abroad. At the same time, says Dr. Jean-Berthenol Zambo, the pandemic has shown that the country's medical system can handle most problems.
I would like to say that the COVID has given us the opportunity to prove that we can treat ourselves in Cameroon. For months, people have not left the country, yet they have been treated in Cameroon.
So far, about 500 patients have used the Medicafrique system, with more signing up every day. For Anne Zwanke in Yaoundé, Cameroon, Moki Edwin Kinzeka for VOA News.
A year ago, on March 11th, the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus outbreak a global pandemic. European countries hoped their well-funded health systems would offer some protection, but the continent was hit hard early on and continues to face high infection rates. Henry Ridgwell reports from London.
Codogno in northern Italy still bears the scars of its unwanted fame, the epicenter of Europe's first coronavirus outbreak. On February 20th last year, a 38-year-old was admitted to the hospital with breathing problems. He was diagnosed with the virus the following day. Head doctor Francesco Tursi recalls the horror that unfolded.
We heard about 1, 2, 3 cases, and we were immediately submerged with patients with serious breathing problems. They couldn't breathe. We didn't even have time to think. This literally changed our lives.
Tursi himself caught the virus days later and spent a month in the hospital. As cases multiplied, northern Italy went into lockdown. It was too little, too late. In the following days, several European countries reported new cases. By the time the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic on March 11th, Spain, France, and several other European states had imposed lockdowns. But Britain held off, delaying its lockdown for 2 more weeks against scientific advice.
Had we introduced lockdown measures a week earlier, we would have reduced the final death toll by at least a half.
Britain would suffer the highest coronavirus death toll in Europe in 2020. Its economy was also among the worst hit, shrinking by 10%.
The UK is really a great example of this notion that when you try to choose between public health or the economy, you lose both.
In Turkey, doctors accused the government of trying to hide the true scale of the pandemic as hospitals filled with patients. Russia was also accused of a cover-up, with doctors claiming the true death toll was likely 3 times higher than the official total of 57,000 deaths in 2020. As lockdowns continued into the summer, governments across Europe pumped billions into their economies to try to keep businesses afloat and people in jobs. Public debt soared. But as a bleak 2020 drew to a close, science offered hope. Medical trials showed that several vaccines offered remarkable protection against COVID-19, with Britain the first Western country to roll out a mass vaccination program.
We cannot underestimate the scale of achievement that this has been, to go from the identification of a new virus and sequence it only in January of 2020 to 11 months later having a number of safe and extraordinarily effective vaccines.
Dangers lurk ahead. Infections remain high, and there are fears over new, more resistant strains of the virus circulating in Europe. Back in Codogno, Dr. Tursi is still treating coronavirus patients. like hundreds of thousands of other frontline workers, Tersi risked his life to help others survive. The pandemic has changed life in countless ways, and it's not over yet. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
A journalist in Iowa is on trial on charges stemming from her coverage of Black Lives Matter protests last year. VOA's Jesusemen Ani reports the case has intensified widespread concerns over press freedom in the United States.
Protests across the United States erupted following the death of George Floyd, a black man while in police custody. Last year was a time of social upheaval across America, and press freedom advocates say journalists faced unprecedented rates of assaults and arrests.
Police deliberately took me.
Andra Suhuri, a reporter for a newspaper in the state of Iowa, says she was pepper sprayed and arrested while covering a demonstration.
I didn't think it was a good idea to run from officers. I wasn't doing anything wrong. So I put up my hands. I said, I'm press, I'm press, I'm press.
Floyd's death in Minneapolis sparked weeks of unrest. Journalists who were covering it sometimes became the story themselves.
They continued broadcasting live despite being assaulted by American police.
According to the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, nearly 130 journalists were arrested or detained in 2020.
That's a more than 1,200% increase from the year before. That's more than our entire history combined. We were launched in 2017. So there were so many journalists arrested and detained in the course of reporting that it was already just an unprecedented and unusual year for press freedom violations, an entirely egregious year for press freedom violations. Why they're taking this one to trial, I don't think anybody has been able to understand fully.
In most cases nationwide, charges against reporters were dropped. Prosecutors in Iowa argue that Suhuri and her then boyfriend, Spencer Robnett, resisted police orders to disperse.
I grabbed her left arm because she was still present and hadn't dispersed from the area. And then she kind of pulled away. That's when Mr. Robnett approached and grabbed her right arm and tried to remove her from my custody.
International rights group Amnesty International sees her case as a test for press freedom in America.
It is very concerning that anybody would take a journalist who was covering a protest as a working journalist to trial. This is a human rights violation, and it is also a violation of the rights in which the United States prides itself around the First Amendment.
For this charge, the jury found Suhuri not guilty, but press freedom advocates say the case could set a precedent for U.S. journalists detained while reporting. Jesusemen Ani, VOA News.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, we thank you for watching.